Sanctions pretty much never work. They were probably never going to work. To the extent they ever even work a little bit, it takes 20, 30 years
Yeah.
until a point at which you have enough generational change that there is upward pressure on a government. If sanctions worked, we would not be in the current situation we're in with Iran, for example. That said, part of what has allowed Russia to continue this offensive is that it has been making record oil profits many of the last few years. And its natural gas exports have died off a bit, of course, but its oil profits have skyrocketed. And that's given Russia enough money and indeed enough time while this has played out to rebuild a fair portion of its military capacity.
President Trump and President Putin have tried and failed yet again to get to an agreement on ceasefire in Ukraine. The Kremlin says the war will continue for as long as necessary to achieve its objectives. All of this, of course, in a week that saw a huge Russian drone attack on Kyiv and the US halt weapon supplies to Ukraine as well. Let's speak to Suriya Jayanti, former US diplomat to Ukraine during Trump's first administration and now senior fellow at the Eurasian Centre for the Atlantic Council. Suriya, welcome to the programme. Good morning from us.
Good morning, and thank you for letting me join you.
It's very good to speak to you. Where are we at here with a failure to agree a ceasefire, huge drone attacks on Ukraine? Trump isn't landing a conclusive message with Putin. He's not getting this thing to end.
Indeed, I think that might be a statement of the obvious at this point, considering multiple rounds of effort by the White House to get Putin to at least consider something resembling a comprehensive ceasefire. But the fact is that it's not in Putin's interest as he sees it. I suspect he believes that he's doing quite well militarily, even though I think the evidence on the ground is rather mixed on that front. Ukraine is also, although struggling, certainly managing to hold its own. So neither side at this moment has a particular interest in suing for peace. Of course, the Ukrainians would like to stop dying and they would like to stop being bombed. But the fact of the matter is, they are pushing a military, if not advantage, at least something resembling parity. And so agreeing to a permanent ceasefire right now would mean they'd have to give up quite a lot of territory, probably in an ultimate peace deal. So it's in their interest to keep fighting to try to get their territory back. And of course, Putin is trying to eke out a win from his disastrous war of aggression.
Yeah, and so we have stalemate in that part of all of this. What about then the call with President Zelensky of Ukraine? And it's actually reported that President Trump has suggested that he would be looking to help Ukraine with air defence because of these escalating Russian attacks. And this, Suriya, follows the Pentagon pausing that weapons shipment, including air defence interceptors and ammunition to Ukraine's army, which came as something of a surprise, I think it's fair to say, for both the Ukrainian and Trump administration officials as well. What was the purpose of that? And is Trump's reassurance to Zelensky, can we believe it?
There are, in fact, mixed messages coming out of the White House right now about whether or not it is continuing to supply Ukraine with military equipment. So the announcement that some of those shipments were going to be stopped certainly took Kyiv by surprise. And they rely very heavily on the US as a source of equipment, specifically for air defenses. So things like Patriot systems to keep Kyiv safe. Nonetheless, reports from Kyiv were a bit more mixed, by which I mean there was no indication that these shipments ever actually stopped. And just as you mentioned just now, even within the US government, there was a great deal of confusion about whether or not things were or were not, in fact, stopped. And so I'm tempted to say it's actually premature to see what is happening. And President Trump has oscillated a bit between being quite vocally supportive of Zelensky and quite vocally not supportive of Zelensky, and similarly with Putin. And so I think it's a bit hard to read the tea leaves on this.
Right, which leaves it really us all in a sort of slightly impossible situation, doesn't it? On where Trump is at with leverage over Putin, with I suppose trying to consider Zelensky's objectives in Ukraine and the necessity of defending Ukraine. This is stalemate at its finest, isn't it?
It is a stalemate light, by which I
Mm.
mean it's not a frozen conflict.
Okay.
Fighting very much continues. People very much keep dying. But it is worth remembering that the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was simply the full-scale invasion. That in
Mm.
fact, the war has been raging since 2014 when Russia invaded following the Revolution of Dignity, also known as Maidan. And Russia then took approximately 15–20% of the country steadily from then on. And now we're looking at somewhere between 20 and 25%. The numbers vary both on time and assessment of the country at any given time. And so Ukraine has been at war and besieged by Russia at this point for 11 years. The current full-scale invasion is just the latest episode.
Yeah, that's a fair point. What about President Trump's latest comment aboard Air Force One just in the last couple of hours? He says he's been tougher on Russia than Iran. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think most people would find that a bit hard to agree with,
Mm.
considering that the United States has bombed Iran, but has not bombed Russia. And I think, at least from the Ukrainian perspective, the White House has been rather accommodating of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, willing to, for example, recognize some merit in Putin's position that the war was even started by Ukraine, or at least that Ukraine was antagonizing Russia. The common complaints from the Kremlin are questions of NATO expansion, questions of its sphere of influence. But really, I think most people think that what is going on is just a violent land grab and an
Mm.
attempt to subjugate a country that Putin does not feel should be independent and certainly does not feel should be leaning towards the West. I think being willing to tolerate those kind of arguments as a justification for an extremely violent invasion is it's hard to reconcile that with the idea that somehow the United States has been hard on Russia.
Yeah, indeed. So then, what could they do to be harder on Russia? Are we still? Is it the greatest hits? More sanctions? What actually equals pressure on Putin?
Well, it's certainly not sanctions. Sanctions pretty much never work. They were probably never going to work. To the extent they ever even work a little bit, it takes 20, 30 years
Yeah.
until a point at which you have enough generational change that there is upward pressure on a government. If sanctions worked, we would not be in the current situation we're in with Iran, for example. That said, part of what has allowed Russia to continue this offensive is that it has been making record oil profits many of the last few years. And its natural gas exports have died off a bit, of course, but its oil profits have skyrocketed. And that's given Russia enough money and indeed enough time while this has played out to rebuild a fair portion of its military capacity and even to bring in-house the manufacturing of things like drones in some cases, or tanks, or other military materiel and equipment. So, sure, if sanctions had ever actually targeted Russia's real sources of income,
Mm.
they could have made a difference perhaps at some point. But I suspect the window of opportunity for that has passed. And I hate to say it, but I have trouble imagining what leverage other than military
Mm.
engagement or properly arming Ukraine the United States could really wield at this point
Okay.
to bring Putin to heel.
Yeah, gosh, and that's a terrifying thought in and of itself. It's certainly a military context that's far different to that of Iran, for example, where, of course, the US struck just a few weeks ago. Suriya, really good to speak to you. Thank you ever so much. Suriya Jayanti is a former US diplomat to Ukraine, now at the Eurasian Centre for the Atlantic Council. You have to question, don't you, if Trump, who was so set on peace in Ukraine and for Ukraine, and indeed elsewhere, if he was to leave office and not have achieved peace, how much would that hang around his neck? So already this morning, and we'll talk more about it later, we've been discussing his big, beautiful bill, this one bill with all his legislative agenda packed into it that has been signed into law. And actually, there's one take that is, hang on a second, what will the legacy of this be? Yes, it's a big political moment, but what does it change in the US? And that could go one way or the other. That could be a huge economic benefit, or it could be that people are left really struggling to access things like healthcare. If you then add in a lack of peacemaking, what will Trump's legacy be? I appreciate completely he's 6 months in. It's probably quite early to discuss legacy, but you see my point, that these are his big, bold ambitions and objectives, and we're discussing there that actually progress is limited.
He also wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and I wonder how that fits in with bombing in Iran.
Yes, fair point.
Does that bring about peace, or is that seen as actually being an aggressive move? Time will tell, I'm sure, and we'll reflect it here, of course, on Times Radio.